So now we're on Daf Samach Hey Amid Beis, and Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai gives a very strange response to this Zaken. And he says to him, Moshe Rabbeinu, if you are right, Mr. Zaken, Mr. Tztuki, that Moshe is an Oev Yisrael Haya, then Lama Ichron Bamidbar Abayim Shana. Why did he take the people through the wilderness, about 3 million strong, for 40 years? Your premise is that Moshe Rabbeinu was an Oev Yisrael, and that's why he would give them 2 days consecutively of Yontif. Amar lo, Rebbe B'kacha Tapotreni, come on, give it a break. You know very well that HaKadosh Baruch Hu took the people of Israel a roundabout way for 40 years for a very important reason. Because otherwise they would have seen battles and wars, and they would have gone back to Mitzrayim. This was all for their benefit. And not only that, could you possibly believe that Moshe Rabbeinu was not an Oev Yisrael? I mean, he dedicated his whole life to the Jewish people. So you're treating me as if I'm an imbecile. You know, you're saying things, Yochanan ben Zakkai, that make no sense. And that's how you rebuff me? Amar lo. So the counter argument of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to this Stuki was Shota. V'lo tehei Torah shlema shalanu kesicha b'teila shalachem. I'm sorry, Naftali, I'm giving Daf Yomi, I'll call you back. Sorry. Shota, late, your whole Torah that you created as the representative of the Tztukim is not worth even a sicha b'teila. It's not, you know, our Torah is perfect. Torah shlema. Shlema means it's a perfect Torah. And, you know, you're saying to me things that are meaningless, that are idle chatter compared to the Torah. So you know what? If you'll talk to me with idle chatter, I'm going to talk to you with idle chatter. And now comes the real proof of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Kosev echad omer tispru chamishim yom. The Torah says count 50 days. The Kosev echad omer, another pasuk says sheva shabbosos tmimus tiena. That we should count 7 complete weeks. So tell me something. Are we counting days or are we counting weeks? There seems to be an explicit contradiction between the two psukim. And it's very strange because according to you, the tztukim, we always begin the counting on Sunday. So we're going to actually end 7 weeks later on Shabbos. Because if you count 7 weeks from Sunday, we end up on Shabbos. The Tztukim said that we should set up Shavuos on Sunday, not on Shabbos. So that if you would count 50 days, then having that pasuk alone, you might have an argument that maybe it's logical to assume that if you start counting on a Sunday, 50 days later, you'll reach on a Sunday, and that's when Shavuos is. So it's Saturday, Sunday, 2 days, 48 hours straight of Ta'anuk. But what are you going to do with the pasuk Sheva Shabbosos Tmimus Tiena, where the Torah says you count 7 weeks? HaKetzad, but we, the Prushim, with our tradition of Torah Sheba'al Peh, we can reconcile these two psukim. How? Kan b'yontiv shechal lios b'Shabbos, kan b'yontiv shechal lios b'Yemtza Shabbos. What day of the week did Pesach fall on? It could have fallen on a Shabbos, and it could have fallen on a day of the week, a weekday. Now, when it says Shiva Shabbosos Tmimos Tieno, Yontif of Pesach fell on Shabbos. If Yontif falls on Shabbos, that's the 15th of Nisan, then tomorrow, Mimachas HaShabbos, which is the 16th of Nisan, we begin to count Sheva Shabbosos Tmimos. And that means that we'll begin counting on a Sunday, and we'll end 7 weeks later on a Shabbos. That's not a problem. But in a case where Yontif falls on a weekday in the middle of the week, then the Omer is not going to be brought on a Sunday. It's going to be brought, let's say if Yontif was on a Tuesday, it's going to be brought on a Wednesday. And then we're going to count days, and that's what it means, Tisbru Chamishim Yom. And the 50th day after that will be Chag HaShavuos. But it won't fall on a Shabbos because we started counting on a weekday. But according to you, you always start counting on a Sunday because that's how you interpret Mimachos HaShabbos. Then by definition, it's got to be on Shabbos. So what would be the case in which you're counting 50 days? Now, the rest of our daf today is a list of different proofs, some of which will be convincing and some not, to prove the interpretation that Mimachos HaShabbos means the day after the first day of Pesach. And the printed text of our Gemara offers a mnemonic device. And you have here Shel Rabbi Eliezer, you have Sofer, Rabbi Yeshua, Mona, Rabbi Shmuel, Ma'amer, Rabbi Yehuda Lamato, Simon. Okay, so we're going to go through each one of these one by one. The first on the list is Shel Rabbi Eliezer. Eino tzarech. Rabbi Eliezer says, you know what? With all due respect to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, we don't need his argument to defeat the interpretation of the Baitusim. We can do it in another way. How so? Harehu Omer, the pasuk says, Tispar Loch. Now, you have to understand this. The word Loch, even though it's in singular, refers to the entire community of Israel. So why does the Torah use the singular? The answer is that when the mitzvah is incumbent upon the entire tzibur of Klal Yisrael, you have to decide who's going to actually implement the mitzvah. And for that, we have the Bezdin HaGadol, the High Court of Israel, who will represent all of Klal Yisrael. Now, what relationship does the Bezdin have with Sfiras HaOmer? I mean, if you were talking about, let's say, Shemitah or Yovel, then we understand that it's not Reuven, Shimon, or Levi as individuals who are going to count the years of the Shemitah or the years of the Yovel, but it's Bezdin, because the mitzvah of Sfira is incumbent upon the entire tzibur, and Bezdin represents the tzibur. But in the case of Sfiras HaOmer, we're talking about an individual obligation. Every single individual, Reuven has to count, Shimon has to count, Levi has to count. So the Torah says Tispar Lecha, or actually Loch, I should read it correctly, which means that Sfira Tulia Bezdin. Why? What role does Bezdin have in the mitzvah of counting the Omer? It's not a Chovas Tzibur. And the answer is Shehem Yodim Lechadesh. Right? We have a mitzvah called HaChodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chadashim Lechadesh Chadashim, and they have to count the new months. That's a responsibility incumbent on Bezdin and exclusively on Bezdin. Nobody could say it's Rosh Chodesh unless the Bezdin HaGadol decides that and declares it's Rosh Chodesh. And therefore, Mimachos HaShabbos Machras Yontif. Meaning, once Bezdin is Makadish the Chodesh of Nisan, we already know exactly when will be the Omer. Why? Because the Omer is going to be brought on the 16th day of Nisan. So it's Bezdin that'll determine when is the 16th day of Nisan, insofar as they declared Rosh Chodesh. So we just fast forward 16 days from Rosh Chodesh, and now we understand that the word Mimachas HaShabbos, which is going to tell me exactly when the sphere begins, has nothing to do with Shabbos, but it has to do with Yontif, which is determined by Bezdin when they establish the Chodesh. Because again, let's keep in mind that the fundamental difference between Shabbos and Yontif is that whereas in Shabbos, Bezdin doesn't play any role, Shabbos is Maisa Brachis, it's always the seventh day of each week, and that's called the Kedusha Kvi V'Kaimi, it's set. Yontif, on the other hand, requires Bezdin to determine when is Rosh Chodesh, and then we know when Yontif is. So when the Torah says Mimachas HaShabbos, and then it says Tispar Lach, and Tispar Lach, as we said before, means Bezdin, the only way I can understand Mimachas HaShabbos is if I assume that the Shabbos here is not the Shabbos Brachis, which would exclude Bezdin, because Bezdin has nothing to do at all with Shabbos Brachis, because Shabbos Brachis, according to the language here, is Shesvirasa B'chol Otam. Any individual without a Bezdin could count 7 days and know exactly when Shabbos is. But here, Tispar Lach requires Bezdin so that Mimachas HaShabbos will know exactly when is the day after Yontif, after the first day of Yontif, the 16th. Rabbi Yeshua has another valid proof, or shall we call it a disproof of the Baitusim. Amra Torah, the Torah says, Menei Yomim v'Kadesh Chodesh. Right, we have two mitzvahs. We have a mitzvah to count the days of the month. Now, how many days are in a Hebrew month? There are two possibilities, no more. It's either the 29th of the month, which is called the Chodesh Chaser, or it's 30 days in the month, which is called the Chodesh Moleh. So therefore, Menei Yomim, you count days, and then you decide, based on when the Molad is, to be Mekadesh the Chodesh. Now, let's apply the same principle to Chag HaShavuos. Menei Yomim, v'Kadesh Atzeres. Count days, because the Torah says that Shavuos is going to be Tisbu Chamishim Yom, 50 days after the Omer is brought. The Kaddish Atzeres. Now you can sanctify the day as Atzeres. So since the Torah says that Shavuos is the culmination of accounting that begins from the time of the Omer, then we have a principle of Menei Yomim v'Kaddish Atzeres. So now we have two countings that lead and culminate with Kiddush. One counting is the days of the month that leads to the Kiddush of Rosh Chodesh, and the other is the counting of the days of the Omer that culminates with the Kiddush of Chag HaShavuos. And now, since they both fit into the same pattern of counting days in order to be Mekadesh, then we can equate them by analogy and say, Ma Chodesh Samach L'Biyaso Nikar, Af Atzeres Samach L'Biyaso Nikeres. What is this analogy going to teach me? After we count the days of the month, which is called Manei Yomim, Kadesh Chodesh. That's called Samach L'Biyaso. Samach L'Biyaso means that we know that there's a repetitive cycle, and we can already predict based on last month and the upcoming month, when is the arrival, that's called Biyaso, of Rosh Chodesh? So again, we're counting the days of the month. Once we count the days of the month, now we can declare when is Rosh Chodesh based on either 29 or 30 days. The same thing applies to Shavuos. That means that based on the first day, which generates accounting, and we're going to count now 50 days, then immediately afterwards we know it's Shavuos. According to Yutztukim, that Shavuos is always on a Sunday by definition, because we started counting on a Sunday, because we Maseches Shabbos mean Shabbos Breishis, is Heich Teheni Keres Mishal Fanecha. So again, according to Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Omer is to be counted on the second day of Pesach, otherwise known as the 16th of Nisan. We can already determine when is the 16th of Nisan based on Rosh Chodesh that came before it. But if according to, right, so we already know when the Omer should be brought once we have the Kiddush of Rosh Chodesh. But if the Baitusim are correct, that we count the Omer on Sunday, meaning it could be the first day of Pesach, if, Pesach fell on a Sunday, then what day of the month is it gonna fall out on? Again, the Baitusim are severing the umbilical cord between the Omer and Shavuos and a calendar date. There's no calendar date over here. It's always going to be start with Sunday. So in that sense, it's not at all similar to the principle of Minei Yomim v'Kadish Chodesh. Now we get to Rabbi Shmuel. He has a different proof. Amr Torah Havei Omer b'Pesach Ushtei Halechem Batzeres. Now, we bring the Omer on Pesach, and then instead of the Omer, we have a parallel korban that identifies Shavuos, and that's called the Shtei Halechem. So we ought to compare, by analogy, these two korbanos, the Omer that kicks it off, and the Shtei Halechem that culminates. Malahalan regel utchilas regel, afkan regel utchilas regel. So now we're comparing the Omer to the Shtei Halechem. The Shtei Halechem is brought on Atzeres, on Chag HaShavuos. Nobody denies that. And therefore, it makes sense that the Omer is also brought on a Chag, on a holiday, namely on Pesach. Well, that works out very well according to the Prushim, but not according to the Baitusim, because the Baitusim are going to bring the Omer on a Sunday. It doesn't have to be that Sunday is the Yontif of Pesach. It's going to be Menachos HaShabbos, but it could be that Pesach is a little bit later on in the week, and therefore the Omer is not going to be brought on Pesach. Let's read the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Usfartem lachem Menachos HaShabbos miyom haviachem es Omer atnufa." Okay, so that's Sfiras HaOmer. I mean, Havas HaOmer. And then it says, Ad Menachos HaShabbos HaShvius Tisbru Chamish Yom Kravtem Mincha Chadosh Al Hashem. You bring the two Lechamim, which is called Mincha Chadosh, the Minchas Shtei Halechem. Now, in this pasuk that says, Menachos HaShabbos HaShvius Tisbru Chamishim Yom, V'kravtem mincha chadosh l'Hashem. So this word Shabbos means a week is called a Shabbos, so we count 7 weeks, and we end up on a Yontif. So you see that the word Shabbos clearly means Yontif. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer, Nemar Shabbos Lamala v'Nemar Shabbos Lamata. Okay, with regard to the Omer, it says Shabbos, and with regard to Shtei Alechem, it says Shabbos, as we just mentioned the Psukim. Mala halan regel utchilas regel somuchla. Okay, so that we did already. Tana Rabbanan, usfartem lachem. Now the question is, we have a principle called Shomer Ka'oneh, and if I hear you recite Kriyat Shema, I could be Yotzei Kriyat Shema. What about counting the Omer? It says, usfartem lachem shetei sfira l'kol echad v'echad. Everybody, as an individual, has to count themselves. They can't be Yotzei with someone else. So that's why in shuls, for example, you'll have the Rav or whoever it is, he'll make the bracha and he'll count the Omer out loud, and then everybody makes their own bracha and counts the sphere. They can't be Yotzi through Shomer Ka'oneh because that general halach doesn't apply to sphere because it says Usfartem lachem. Lachem shetei sfira l'kol echad v'echad. Now the Pella here is that we saw already earlier that the pasuk says Tispar Lach. And Tispar Lach, we said, is indicative of a communal obligation. Here it's Svartem Lachem, not Lach, and it's an individual obligation such that I can't be Yotze even with Shomer Ka'oneh. I have to count myself. So the Chizkuni, if you ever heard of him, he's one of the famous commentaries on the Torah, one of the Balei Tosfos. He says that there are 2 mitzvahs in the Omer. There's one mitzvah of the Omer that's incumbent on individual, and that's written in the Torah as Lachem. And then there's a mitzvah sfira on the entire tzibur. And Bezdin, representing the tzibur, will fulfill the mitzvah of Tispar Lach, not Lachem. So my Rebbe once asked the question, why would Bezdin get involved in why would there be a Chovas Tzibur in Sfiras Omer, such that Bezdin gets involved? And the answer is because it's only through the counting of the Omer that we know when is Shavuos to sanctify the 50th day of Shavuos. And for that we need Bezdin, because the sanctification of a day in the Hebrew calendar is a communal obligation. Mimachas HaShabbos, Mimachas Yontif. So now again, we're going to contend against the Baitusim that the word Shabbos here means Yontif, the first day of Pesach. Eina el Mocher Shabbos Beishis. Maybe says the Brisa, we should interpret the pasuk the way the Baitusim interpret it. And Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda Omer Hareu Omer Tispru Chamishim Yom. Kol Sfiros Sha'at Sofer Lo Yiu El Chamishim Yom. Now, Vim Tomer, if you're going to argue like the Tzdukim, that Mimocha Shabbos Breishis, right? It's a Sunday. But once again, if it's a Sunday, then we're not going to wait and count 50 days to reach Shavuos. Why? Because Pa'omen Shatamotzi Chamishim V'echad. Sometimes you'll find that you have to count 51. Upam Shatamotzi Chamishim U'shnayim. Chamishim U'shlosha, Chamishim V'arba, Chamishim V'chamesh, Chamishim V'sheish. So I'm just going to summarize one of the notes here, very helpful here. He says, if Pesach falls out on a Saturday, on a Shabbos, then okay, everybody agrees that the Omer is counted the next day, which is the first day of Pesach, which is the morning after the first day of Pesach, which is the 16th of Nisan, and it ends 50 days later. Fine. Now, a year later, Pesach began on a Friday. Now, according to the Baitusim, You're not going to count on Shabbos, the day after the first day of Pesach, 16th of Nisan, because they're interpreting Mocha Shabbos means Mocha Shabbos Beishis, which means you're going to only start counting on Sunday. Now, if you start counting on Sunday, then the counting will end 51 days after the starting point of the previous year, which was the second day of Pesach. Would Pesach begin on a Thursday, the count would be 52 days after the second day of Pesach. And this contradicts the Torah's requirement that the Omer consists of a counting of no more than 50 days. He claims here in the name of the Rashba that it's not really clear where the pasuk states that 50-day limit must be measured from the same date each year. And finally, with this we'll end for today. Rav Yehuda ben Beseira Omer Nitzarach, he has his own proof. Here we turn to Daf Samach Vav. Hareu Omer Tispar Loch Sfira Tluya Bebezdin. Loch means an individual body of Bezdin representing the entire Tzibur. Is Yotza Shabbos Breishis Shesfirasa B'Cholada. Okay, we've seen this in the past. So Belinator tomorrow we'll pick it up from Rabbi Yossi Omer, and that's going to be at 12 noon. When is Ulpan at 12 noon? Yeah. Okay. All right, Rabbosai. So let me wish you a very fine day. And that's it. We'll see you tomorrow.